Wesaþ and welcome to Wyrdwayz. Now in this episode I'm going to be talking about the Anglo-Saxon rune Thorn. Now it just turned out that this rune had so much I could say about it that I've decided to split it into two parts. So this is the first part, and in this part I'm going to be talking about women, warriors and thorn trees. Now just like to say before we get into it, thank you to all of my subscribers. I really do appreciate your support. Because of the way YouTube works, the more subscribers I get, the more visibility there is of my work. So I really do appreciate you subscribing. Please do so if you haven't already, and if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. I've also now got a Patreon, and I'll put the details below. So this rune, it has the sound of TH, a th kind of sound. Now this letter was eventually dropped from the English alphabet. So one thing, if you ever do write in runes, don't put a tear and a hale to make the th sound. Use this rune. I once stopped somebody having a tear and a hale tattooed on their head in place of the thorn rune, so don't make that mistake. So I'm going to start with the rune poems. Now this rune also appears in the Elder and the Younger Futhark, and so as you'll hear, the Icelandic and the Norwegian rune poems are rather different to the Anglo-Saxon one. So I'll start with the Icelandic rune poem. Giant, torture of women and cliff dweller and husband of a giantess. Okay, so that's the Icelandic, and now I shall read you the Norwegian. Giant causes anguish to women, misfortune makes few men cheerful. Now both of those rune poems display the dominant themes of the thyrse, the giant, and women being caused pain and anguish from the thyrse. And as you'll hear, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem is rather different. So we will do this in Anglo-Saxon first. Thorn befjärlig skap, thane je wilchum, anfängist evil, unje mittum letha, manne je wilchen, thay him mid resteth. And now in English, the translation is: the thorn is exceedingly sharp, an evil thing for any knight to touch, uncommonly severe on all who sit among them. So you can see that in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem we've had two things swapped out. The thyrse has been swapped out for the thorn, and the women have been swapped out for knight or warrior. So I just want to look at, well, it's my belief that the original Anglo-Saxon rune poem would have been along the same lines as both the Icelandic and Norwegian, and at some point those two things were swapped out and changed. So I just want to look at why, and we'll start with the warrior. Now we can draw many parallels between early Anglo-Saxon society and the Germanic tribes on the continent that Tacitus wrote about. And I have a piece here from Tacitus Germania where he describes the women folk in respect to when battles were happening, and I'm just going to read that to you now. Close by them, too, are their nearest and dearest, so that they can hear the shrieks of their womenfolk and the wailing of their children. These are the witnesses whom each man reverences most highly, whose praise he most desires. It is to their mothers and wives that they go to have their wounds treated, and the women are not afraid to count and compare the gashes. They also carry supplies of food to the combatants and encourage them. It stands on record that armies already wavering and on the point of collapse have been rallied by the women, pleading heroically with their men, thrusting forward their bared bosoms and making them realise the imminent prospect of enslavement, a fate which the Germans fear more desperately for their women than for themselves. Indeed, you can secure a surer hold on these nations if you compel them to include among a consignment of hostages some girls of noble family. More than this, they believe that there resides in women an element of holiness and a gift of prophecy, and so they do not scorn to ask their advice or lightly disregard their replies. In the reign of the Emperor Vespasian, we saw Velida, long honoured by many Germans as a divinity, and even earlier they showed a similar reverence for Aurania and a number of others, a reverence untainted by servile flattery or any presence of turning women into goddesses. So we can see here the way that the Germanic tribes on the continent regarded their women folk. Now let's move forward a few hundred years and have a look at a post-migration story of a woman. Now, this is in fact the earliest written record of an English woman, and it wasn't actually written by an English person, but was written down by Procopius of Caesarea. And he was a high-ranking official in the Emperor Justinian's employment in his civil service. Now, I actually really enjoy reading Procopius. It's very interesting stuff. And I'd love to tell you this story now, but I simply don't have the time. So I'll be telling that story from Procopius on my Patreon instead. But to cut a long story short, it's a story of an English girl. She was the sister of an Anglo king who was settled in Britain, and she was dishonoured, and so rather than taking it, she decided to take matters into her own hands and deal with it in a very decisive and aggressive way. And Procopius tells us, she took up the duties of a man and proceeded the deeds of war. She accordingly collected 400 ships immediately and put on board them an army of not fewer than 100,000 fighting men, and she in person led forward this expedition against Avani. So I think Procopius was vastly exaggerating about the size of the army. That's extremely unlikely. It's far more likely that she actually took 4 ships with her, and each one of those ships probably held 50 to 80, possibly 100 men. Procopius was probably thinking more about the kind of armies that the Romans used to invade, but the Anglo-Saxons generally had much smaller armies when they went to invade. But anyway, that is a really interesting story about this English girl, and it really does show, as I was saying, that women could be, seen in a heroic way and could be strong and capable and even lead armies into wars against other tribes. Now, Procopius also, in his extensive work about the Gothic Wars, he tells us about other strong women at this time as well. And one of them was Amalasuntha, who was the leader of the Ostrogoths in the 6th century. Now, she led her people for quite a number of years and was considered to be very fair and just and to make good decisions by her people. So it's really interesting, the information that we can gain, and we do gain a lot of information from people as part of the Roman Empire who write about these Germanic tribes. Now, unfortunately, it is definitely true to say that as the Anglo-Saxon period went on and as things became a lot more Christianized, and certainly after the Norman conquest, the position of women fell and they did become regarded as inferior people compared to the men. Christianity is, after all, a patriarchal religion, and certainly as Anglo-Saxon society became more Christianized, and obviously the people that wrote things down would have been very influenced by the teachings of Christianity, we can see this influence taking hold. And in maxims we definitely see this influence where it says, "A wife belongs at her embroidery, a gadding woman gives rise to gossip. She is often accused of vice, men speak of her contemptuously, often her complexion fades." Well, I am a feminist, of course, and it's sad that as Christianity took hold, that attitude towards women did persist and continue to do so for many, many hundreds of years. As I've said, women in pagan Anglo-Saxon times did have a much better lot than women in subsequent ages. So, if the Anglo-Saxons were not misogynists, then were they just simply obsessed by war and warriors? Now, it's definitely true to say that warriors did feature heavily in Anglo-Saxon poetry, and obviously Beowulf is the prime example of this. And they did have a heroic society. Their values were courage, loyalty, honesty. The Germanic heroic vein ran very, very deep through this society. It really was vital to the way that they operated. So again, let's turn to Tacitus, because we can find out quite a lot about these pre-migration Germanic tribes from him. And I think it's true to say that the way that the pre-migration Germanic tribes were pretty much rings true for early Anglo-Saxon society in the 4th, 5th and into the 6th centuries. So this is what Tacitus can tell us about the heroic code that I just mentioned. "The assembly is competent also to hear criminal charges, especially those involving the risk of capital punishment. The mode of execution varies according to the offence. Traitors and deserters are hanged on trees. Cowards, shirkers and sodomites are pressed down under a wicker hurdle into the slimy mud of a bog. This distinction in the punishments is based on the idea that offenders against the state should be made a public example of, whereas deeds of shame should be buried out of men's sight." So to be a coward at this time was truly a shameful thing that was worthy of punishment. A true Anglo-Saxon had courage and honour, was brave. Now, what we mustn't forget is that the early Anglo-Saxon period was a very unstable one, and war was endemic. It was tribe against tribe. They were fighting constantly for land and power, and it really was a case of be tough or be killed. The tribes were always fighting amongst each other, fighting for land and power. And to survive, you needed to have that kind of aggressive, forceful kind of energy that this rune can represent. Now, this is an aggressive male kind of energy, and I think it's true to say that it can be dangerous when out of control. Now, if you didn't possess this kind of aggressive male energy, then you needed to be protected by somebody who did have it. And early tribes can be described as military in nature and would have been ruled by a tribal chief or a king. Now, this tribal chief, his role was to protect his people, and in turn he would be supported by his tribe, the farmers, the people that were not warriors would have supported the warriors who would have in turn protected them from attack from other tribes. So a leader, above all, a leader had to be a mighty warlord, and they called this a Drighton. Now, as I said, his main role was to protect his people, to keep them safe, and to lead them on expeditions to gain more power, land and resources. Now we can hear this in Beowulf, lines 4 to 11, when we hear about shield chafing, and what a wonderful poem this is. So I'm going to read you now in Anglo-Saxon, lines 4 to 11 out of Beowulf. Oft shield chafing shiava thriatum, monogam maithen meod settler of tea, egg soda erla, sitten erles werd, fia shaft funden, hithas floflea je bed, weax under waknum, way off mundum thar, of fat himai wilchum sitendula, over hronlada, hulan shoulder, gomban gulden. That was God cooning. Isn't that marvellous? I love it. So now in English, which doesn't sound so good in my opinion. Oh, where's me English? Oh, here it is. Sorry, I'm going mad. Oft shield the chafing from squadroned foes, from many a tribe the mead bench tore, awing the earls. Since erst he lay friendless, a foundling, fate repaid him, for he waxed under welkin, in wealth he throve, till before him the folk both far and near, who house on the whale path heard his mandate, gave him gifts, a good king he. So yes, shield chafing can, he is like the perfect warlord, the perfect leader, as it says, a good king he. That was God cooning. He is like the archetypal warlord, the leader of the tribe. So how did tribe members interact with their chief? What did it actually mean to serve a chief and be his retainer? So again, I'm going to turn to Tacitus, as he provides us with a wealth of information. And what Tacitus tells us is, on the field of battle, it is a disgrace to a chief to be surpassed in courage by his followers, and to the followers not to equal the courage of their chief. And to leave a battle alive after their chief has fallen means lifelong infamy and shame. To defend and protect him, and to let him get the credit for their own acts of heroism, are the most solemn obligations of their allegiance. The chiefs fight for victory, the followers for their chief. So this is really interesting. It shows how really the chief, the Drighton, was all important. They would put him above themselves. They would let him take the credit for any heroic deeds that they did, and to leave the battlefield alive if your chief died was a lifelong shame. A very different attitude to we have now, surely. So I'm going to again turn to Tacitus. I keep doing that today, don't I? Going to turn to Tacitus and get some more information about Germanic warriors. When not engaged in warfare, they spend a certain amount of time in hunting, but much more in idleness, thinking of nothing else but sleeping and eating. For the boldest and most warlike men have no regular employment, the care of the house, home and fields being left to the women, old men and weaklings of the family. In thus dawdling away their time, they show a strange inconsistency, at one and the same time loving indolence and hating peace. So having just said that, I think now is a good time to nip off to the Mead Hall again, because you know how I like to go to the Mead Hall. And here I want to show you some of the weaponry that a wealthy warrior, one of the retainers of a Drayton, would have had. But before we go there, I just want to point out that most warriors wouldn't have possessed such weapons. The average member of the Fyrd would have had little more than a spear and a shield, and certainly when I joined a Dark Age reenactment group many years ago, all we needed to get going was a spear and a shield, and you know, you could quite happily go your whole reenactment career with only a spear and a shield. And again, Tacitus tells us they transact no business, public or private, without being armed, but it is a rule that no one shall carry arms until the state authorities are satisfied that he will be competent to use them. Then, in the presence of the assembly, either one of the chiefs or the young man's father or some other relative presents him with a shield and a spear. These among the Germans are the equivalent of the man's toga with us, the first distinction publicly conferred upon a youth who now ceases to rank merely as a member of a household and becomes a citizen. So having said that, we're going to nip off to the Mead Hall now and have a look at a wealthy warrior and some of the weapons and protection that he may have possessed.
And first, a few lines from the Finnsburg fragment. This is an epic Old English poem of which we sadly only have 50 lines remaining. The following lines quoted provide us with information about Anglo-Saxon weaponry, which supports archaeological evidence. Birds of battle screech, the grey wolf howls, spears rattle, shield answers shaft. Then many a thane, laden in gold, buckled on his sword belt. The hollow shield called for bold men's hands, helmets burst, then Guthar withdrew, a wounded man. He said that his armour was almost useless, his byrnie broken, his helmet burst open. And now let's have a look at some of the weapons that were used, and we'll start with the axe. The sight of a fired-up warrior with axe in hand is enough to send a fear through the heart of even the bravest warrior. To fight with an axe, one needs to be confident, brave and assertive. A heavy yet devastating weapon, it is easy to overcommit with an axe. You could then be easily undone by someone with a much lighter, more nimble weapon, such as the spear, which was the most common weapon amongst the Anglo-Saxon infantry. This weapon definitely had its shortcomings, despite its fearsome and devastating appearance. The early Anglo-Saxons sometimes used a type of axe known as a Francisca. It was quite small with a very heavy blade for its diminutive size. This axe was designed for one purpose, throwing. Imagine this, an army poised to fight. They are suddenly attacked by a mass volley of small, heavy axes biting into their ranks. The mayhem which ensues is swiftly followed by the onrush of eager warriors. And now let's take a look at the sayax. The sayax was a single-edged knife. These would have been carried by all warriors of all ranks, known as the walsiax, killing knife. This weapon would have been useful in situations where a sword was not appropriate. Remember, at this stage, the sword was basically a hacking weapon, and to hack, you need enough space. The sayax, however, had a pointy end and could be used to stab. This was ideal for piercing through byrnies, the chainmail of your opponent, as well as being great for finishing off your opponent. The sword, without doubt the most iconic of the Anglo-Saxon weapons, swords were actually pretty rare, being as valuable as they were. Indeed, being such prized weapons, they would often be handed down from one generation to the next. This would, in the eyes of our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, imbue them with a great power. Perhaps they thought that the weapons took on the might and bravery of their previous owners. The earliest Anglo-Saxon examples were straight-edged, known as the spatha. The upper and lower guards were made of an organic material such as horn, bone or wood, and they had no pommel, just a large washer. In the 6th century, this style evolved into the fullered broadsword type, which featured a large metal pommel. Again, the crossguards were made of an organic material, which would then either be sandwiched with, embellished with, or completely covered in a precious metal. The mail shirt, also known as the byrnie, would only have been worn by the very wealthiest of warriors. The earliest example would have been short and pretty similar in size and length to a modern-day t-shirt. As you can imagine, the construction of a mail shirt would have been very labour-intensive and would have taken many hours of work. Thin strips of iron were cut from a sheet, or iron would have been drawn through a draw plate before being wound around a cylindrical former. Links were then cut to size and then compressed so that the ends overlapped. Half of these then had their ends welded shut in the forge. The ends of each of the remaining links were flattened before holes were punched in them. The mail shirt was then painstakingly assembled, a punched ring being linked to 4 of the welded rings and a rivet being through the hole to close up the link. Again, only the very wealthiest of warriors would have possessed a helmet. 6 examples of helmets have been found in England, which experts have identified as being Anglo-Saxon. The helmet in the video is a copy of the 7th century Wollaston helmet, also known as the Pioneer helmet, which was excavated in Northamptonshire. Other examples are, of course, the amazing Sutton Hoo helmet, the Coppergate helmet from York, the Benty Grange helmet from Derbyshire, the Shorewell helmet from the Isle of Wight, and the Staffordshire Horde helmet. From Beowulf we hear, boar shapes flashed above their cheek guards, the brightly forged work of goldsmiths, watching over those stern-faced men. The earliest Anglo-Saxon helmets were typically domed with cheek flaps, neck guards and a crest or ridge. How amazing it would have been to see glistening helmets with the boar crest on top.
And we're back from the Mead Hall. Any excuse to go down there, really. So before we went, I mentioned the word feared, and this is a word used by many to describe the Anglo-Saxon army. Now, it's certainly true to say that the nature of the feared changed very greatly between the earliest migrations and when Harold Godwinson stood on the battlefield to face the Norman army in 1066. Obviously, to begin with, there was very little organisation, and it would have been bands, groups, tribes, warring between each other. And probably as things went on, things became more structured, as indeed things do. Now, one thing we do know is that the Germanic warriors, they didn't use cavalry very much. They were mainly foot soldiers. And one British writer tells us around the time of the first migrations that they know not the use of cavalry. And in the story I mentioned earlier from Procopius about the English girl, the English princess, he actually says, "Now these islanders are valiant beyond any of the barbarians that we know, and they enter battle on foot. And this is not merely because they are unpractised in horsemanship." Now he then goes on to tell us that it was because they didn't actually have any horses on Britia, which is a bit rubbish, as we know. But he's not the only person I'm not the only Roman to have mentioned this lack of cavalry. As Caesar, in his De Bello Gallico, he talks about the Nervi tribe, and he says that they had no strength in cavalry. And as I said, this fighting on foot seems to be the main form of fighting from Germanic warriors and Anglo-Saxon warriors indeed. Now, Tacitus mentions many times within Germania the sacred groves where the Germanic tribes had rituals, made sacrifices, and performed all sorts of ritual activities within these sacred groves in the wood where I am now. And I can certainly see why they had such a connection with woods and with groves, because I am never happier than when I'm in the woods. It's the place where I feel at my happiest, when I'm in the woods. Now, while Caesar tells us that certainly the Nervi tribe had no strength in cavalry, he does tell us how they used trees to their advantage to impede the mighty Roman cavalry. And to do this, they use hedges, and Caesar tells us they cut into young saplings and bend them, so that by the thick sprouting of horizontal boughs and through interweaving brambles and thorns, they ensured that these hedges served in the manner of walls of fortification, which were not only impenetrable, but which might not even been see-through. Now, it's quite likely that when they constructed these hedges, these impenetrable hedges, that the shrub, the tree of choice would have been thorn. You've only got to have tried to get through a thorn hedge. Why you'd want to, I don't know, because you get cut to shreds, but you've only got to have tried that to know just what these trees are like when they grow tightly together. Now, it's also very likely that the Germanic tribes used these enclosure hedges in their sacred groves, basically to demarcate that sacred space, in the same way that a church has churchyard walls to kind of separate that sacred space from the more mundane space elsewhere. And one such example was found when an excavation was made at Blacklow Hill in Warwickshire. And what they found there was the remains that seemed to indicate a planted enclosure hedge, which was then surrounded by a fence and centred on two burials. So really, as a modern heathen, if you want to worship in the same way as your Germanic ancestors, then you need to create an enclosure hedge within a wood. Wouldn't that be lovely? It'd be great to have a wood to do that in, wouldn't it? One of my dreams, have my own woodland. So here, within this aspect, this thorn, this enclosure hedge, we see the protective qualities of this rune, which is one of the qualities, one of the energies that this rune thorn does have. What I would say is, yes, it is protective, but it's not protective in the same way that, say, the Algi's rune is, which to me, I always think of an outstretched hand with that. Its protective qualities are that of the thorn. Yes, it will protect, but it protects in a more aggressive way, and it's quite likely that you may get prickled yourself. I think that's a good way to think about this rune. And of course, during this episode, I've also spoken extensively about warriors. And this rune also possesses that same very male, very aggressive kind of energy, a necessary force, a forceful energy. And these are the kind of energies that this rune possesses. And this is also a rune of boundaries, and this can be seen within the enclosing hedges that I spoke of. Now, while I don't want to worry you, and it would be unwise of me to do that, what I do want to say is this rune is very powerful, and you do need to treat it with a lot of respect. I'm going to put a link to a video that I made as part of my first series about the Elder Futhark below, where I discussed the rune Thorne. Now, if you watch that, you'll see that I was under a oak tree, which is sacred to Thorne, who this rune is connected with, but I don't want to talk about that in this episode because I spoke about that a lot before. And there was a storm going on, and I was working with that rune for that video. Now, literally the day after, I had an accident, and you can't probably see it, but I have a scar on my nose, and I call that my Thorne or my Thorn scar, because I was making some runes. I was staying at my parents'. I was making some runes. I'm a bit of a liability when it comes to power tools. Being an artist, I'm a bit too airy-fairy for that, I guess. But and I foolishly hadn't put on any safety goggles. I was using a circular saw, cutting some runes, and a piece of branch flew and hit me. I was so lucky I didn't lose an eye, but it hit me right between the eyes and gave me a nasty cut on my nose, for which I still have a scar for. And I always feel that scar is a reminder to me of the power, of the energies of this rune. So I'm going to finish this episode there, and I'd just like to say thank you for joining me. Thank you, Thay. And if you like this video, I'd be really grateful if you could give it a like, and please subscribe to my channel. And I will see you for the next part of this episode, which is coming very soon. Okay, thank you, Thay. Ayla.